Most United States students cannot distinguish between the Russian and United States constitutions. A leading Democratic representative pulls a fire alarm to thwart a House vote on spending. And people on both the right and on the left are up in arms about an alleged Nazi-like book ban taking place all across the country. Oy vey, friends. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Timeless, the show where I talk about subjects through what I call a timeless worldview. It is great, as always, to be with you. Just as a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below if you like what you see and would like to be notified with every new piece of content that I post. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. It's no secret that I identify as a conservative, and that's kind of been a label that's been tarnished recently in the United States. But I'm proud to say that I'm a conservative because I want to conserve the principles of the American Constitution. But I sort of want to make something clear about my worldview and kind of the ethos of this show. Yes, I'm a conservative, but really, my interest in politics, such as abortion policy or tax policy, isn't necessarily the things that make me a conservative or a Republican. I call myself a conservative because I want to, as I said, conserve the best ideas that have been promulgated all throughout human history. Human civilization, which has been around for about 5,000 years, if you can count earlier people who existed in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, but really civilization started about 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years of human civilization has produced some conclusions. And I think those conclusions offer us some timeless wisdom that can be applied to anything that is going on in our era. So my hope to do on this show and to do for all of you is apply some of those conservative, timeless, eternal ideas to all of the crazy stuff that is going on. There are just some things that work over time and that have been proven, and we ought to pay attention to those things. One of those things is that in order to secure the health of your society, the health of your country and your civilization, the populace needs to know why that civilization is a great one. Think about it. If you have a huge population of people who don't believe in what their country is doing and don't believe in the experiment that they are living in, that experiment is going to fail. It's like a mother or a father. If they don't care about being a mother and a father, if they don't care about building a good, robust, strong, healthy nuclear family, then they're going to be terrible parents and they're not going to have a great family situation. This is true on a micro level, and of course it's true on a macro level, which is why an article that I recently read is so concerning. This was in Just the News, and it profiled a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College. His name is Nick Giordano, and he reported to this news outlet that 90% of the students who he teaches at the college level cannot differentiate between the United States Constitution and the Russian Constitution. Oh my gosh, those two documents literally could not be more different. And yet, apparently, our young, growing Americans don't really know the difference. Quoting from Professor Giordano, "So for the last decade, I have assigned my students a constitutional exercise. It's to see if they could identify the Constitution, and 90% of my students can't differentiate between the American from the Russian Constitution. It is really startling." It is really startling, but honestly, it's not surprising. And there is a difference between those two words. Startling, obviously, is this kind of immediate reaction of being jolted by something. But being surprised means that it is a novel idea to you. We've known this. This is something that has been on the rise for the past few decades. To give you some more examples of how this is not exactly new news, according to UPenn's Annenberg Center for Public Policy, only 1 in 6 United States adults could name any branches of the United States government. It's really not that hard. There are only 3. You learn it. Well, I learned it at least in 3rd grade, maybe 5th grade. A lot of American public schools nowadays are probably not even teaching that anymore. 1 in 6 U.S. adults can't name any of those three. I think we know some of those 1 in 6 U.S. adults. Karine Jean-Pierre, our press secretary, is probably one of them. Andrew Klavan, one of my favorite talk show hosts, calls her Karine John diversity hire. Kamala Harris is probably one of those 15% of adults who can't identify any of the branches. She would probably say, if we asked her about the Constitution, she'd probably respond, "The Constitution is what the Constitution has always been, and the Constitution has always and has been the Constitution." That's probably how she would answer that question. Just deflect and say this word salad. President Biden, honestly, I would be pretty shocked if at this point in his mental competency he could answer that question. He'd probably say, "Come on, man. It's so obvious. I'm not even going to answer it." But that would be a nice duck for him. And Mitch McConnell even would probably just stare at you for a long few seconds instead of answer the question. How can we expect adults or people who are in elementary school to know things that it seems, at least, that many of our leaders may not know? You think I'm exaggerating? Well, there was a clip that went viral a few months ago of a woman named Charnel Belkengren. She was questioned by Senator John Kennedy when she was nominated by President Biden to serve on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Washington. So this is a job that requires a lot of constitutional knowledge. Let's listen to how this appointee to the federal government could answer questions about the founding document.
Judge on the far end. Tell me what Article 5 of the Constitution does.
Article 5 is not coming to mind at the moment.
Okay. How about Article 2?
Neither is Article 2.
Okay.
Okay, obviously these are more specific questions about the Constitution than just what are the three branches of government. But my gosh, someone in her position ought to really know the answers to those very simple questions. A 2017 Kansas survey also found that about a fifth, 20% of high school students can't name any of the First Amendment freedoms. They couldn't even name that the First Amendment guarantees the right to free speech. I would understand if some people may not be able to identify freedom to associate, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, but my gosh, to not even be able to get freedom of speech in the First Amendment, 20%, oi. And then finally, the Nation's Report Card, which is an annual report of test scores and proficiency in various subjects that came out in October of 2022, found that only 13% of 8th graders met proficiency standards for U.S. history. That requires explaining themes, people, events. Only 13% of them met those standards. Less than 20% scored at proficiency levels in civics. And 8th graders scored 5 points lower in American history compared to 2018 in 2022. So over just those 4 years, there was a 5-point drop. So why is this going on and why should we care? As I said earlier, it really is determinative of the health of a civilization and of a country if people don't know about that civilization or about that country. But I want to explore why this is happening and why it has changed. Because if you go back like 20, 30 years ago, even 40, 50, well, certainly 40, 50 years ago, people knew more of this stuff. And they didn't even need a college education or a particularly elite high school education to be able to know about this. What has changed from then to now? Well, of course, there has been this huge narrative that has really erupted over the past half century, and especially in the past 10 years, and especially in the past 5 years, that America is a systemically racist country, that we are and have always been defective. We have an ugly history which haunts us to this day. The tentacles of systemic racism creep in to the modern moment and wrap around every institution and strangle them with their bigotry. So if we think about this in terms of incentives for students to learn about our country, if they are told that the country in which they live is a bigoted, terrible country, Why would they want to learn about the Constitution and about the document that is the basis of this bigotry? I wouldn't want to learn about that. I would think that it's a waste of my time. It's sad because if it were taught correctly, people would understand what an extraordinary document it is. We haven't always lived up to that document, of course, but there is really no system like the one that has been outlined in the United States Constitution. I mean, look at the Electoral College. That has gotten a really bad rap these days, but the Electoral College is so deftly designed as to give smaller states the opportunity to have a political say in the presidential election alongside these bigger states. Because if you just took the tally of the votes according to the popular vote, then the most populous states like California and New York, all of these coastal people where most of the country lives, would drown out the individuals who live in the middle or in the pockets of the country. So the Electoral College system, though not perfect, is a really neat design to try to get around that. How about the balance of power between the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives? Very few systems around the world have something that is like that. The Senate has 100 people serving, 2 from each state, and it is given certain responsibilities because there is that equality in representation. But then the House has 435 because it is based on proportion of the population as far as how many representatives are allocated to the U.S. House. And that's why the U.S. House is given, in many cases, more responsibilities than the United States Senate. The U.S. House is supposed to get more into the micro legislative details to represent their own state, their own part of their state. And then the U.S. Senate, because it is smaller and more equally representative, kind of deals with the more macro things that pertain to all of the states and their relationship with one another as a country. That's a very, very well designed balance. Even if you look at the Bill of Rights, I mean, what other country has a list of the things that the government cannot do to you? The preambles of most of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution start with, "Nor shall Congress make any law that abridges freedom of speech, that denies citizens equal protections of the law." That wording is amazing. Nor shall Congress make any law. That is saying your government can't do this to you. No matter what they think of you, there are protections that they are not allowed to step over the line about. But people don't learn about this. They don't learn about the magnificence of the system. Instead, they are told that it is a terrible system. And so from an incentive point of view, there's no desire to learn about that terrible system. And additionally, we see that there's been a lot of disrespect of the Constitution and other rules of law in the country, just everyday statutes that states make. You know, there were those historic riots against police in 2020 and the riots though have subsided, but the sentiment that the police is defective has continued to today. It has led to many, many changes in the law, such as in Illinois, they got rid of cash bail because supposedly that's terrible and that's racist, and it's evidence of a police carceral overhanded state. Here in LA County, where I'm from, where we filmed the show, they also just passed their own version of a no cash bail law. So essentially, if you're arrested, you don't have to put up bail to get out until your trial date. They've gotten rid of that. So if you're arrested, basically they tell you when your trial date is and you can just go roam free. There have been obviously a total disregard of immigration laws, which are both outlined in the Constitution and in everyday state law. So think about it from the American student's perspective. You see all of these laws being changed really quickly, being disregarded like they don't matter. And so in addition to not wanting to learn about the Constitution, there's this sense, why do I need to learn about the Constitution if it can just be so easily disregarded and thrown out? So the incentive structure makes sense for why we are seeing such a dismal outcome as far as lack of constitutional literacy. And also, there's been a transformation of the university specifically that has made teaching the Constitution seem like an imperialist thing to do? Allow me to explain. I talked about this in another episode of Timeless. American universities used to really be the place where you would go and learn how to be an American citizen. High school, you're young, you're supposed to learn about all these different subjects, math, science, reading, the broad strokes of US history. But it used to be the case that when you went to college, you got down more into the details and really learned about your responsibilities as an American. Many colleges and universities had required American constitutional law classes, certainly Western civilization requirements. But as American universities have become more international, they have moved away from this idea that they are creating future Americans. And instead, they've just embraced this idea that they are creating future leaders in general without the American identity attached to it. This past school year, 2021 to 2022, or I guess 2 school years ago, there were nearly 1 million international students at colleges and universities across the United States. There are about 16 million students total, so that is not an insignificant percentage, that nearly 1 million out of the 16 million are not from the United States. Where a lot of those students are from, interestingly, is China, as Donald Trump would say. We, the United States, being the horrible xenophobic country that we are, award the highest number of student visas to Chinese students than any other country on planet Earth. In 2020, which was during COVID, so there were obviously restrictions on the amount of students who could come and study in the United States, we awarded 382,000 student visas to Chinese students alone. The second place country was India, which gave about 200,000 student visas to Chinese students. So the point is, the audience has really changed. The student body has changed at universities. And as the student body has become more international, there was this idea that percolated that if we teach that international student body about the American Constitution, we're being imperialist because we are forcing them to learn about our system when they're not from our system. This really started at Stanford University in the 1990s. In 1988, Stanford got rid of its Western civilization requirement. And then from there, a lot of the classes about the United States, about Western Civ, kind of went by the wayside. There were those famous protests, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And it succeeded because a lot of countries followed in lockstep. What we need to do, if we are going to restore this country, is that we need to bring back requirements about the Constitution and about Western civilization. Oh, but it's imperialist and some people don't know what. Forget about it. If you are an international student coming to study in the United States of America, you're coming to study in the United States of America. You made that choice. And this is an American university, and they have every right to teach American history and constitutional law. Let's put ourselves in the perspective of an American student going to another country, let's say France or Germany or even somewhere in the Middle East, if they would let in American students to their universities, or India. Let's say you're a foreign student going to a college across the world. Would you be upset if that college taught you a required course about their country? Of course you wouldn't, because you would understand, I'm going across the world to their territory. This is the university that they have built themselves. And so this is what I have signed up for. So why are we okay with it when other people do it? But then when we do it, all of a sudden we're being the imperialists. It's ridiculous. And it is going to end up in dismal outcomes already. So before we go on, I want to quickly tell you about MyPillow. I use all MyPillow products, it seems. Probably not all, but I use like 5 or 6 of them. I use the slippers. I use the MyTowels. I sleep on the MyPillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets. And you can too. Also at a discount. if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you will get 60% off of the Giza Dream bed sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99, which is a really good deal if you use the promo code Hartman. You'll also, for a limited time, get Mike Lindell's softcover book free with any order. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listeners square, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. I really do love and enjoy these products. I would not advertise to you any products that I did not use, so please do go check those out. Speaking of a crisis of American education, you know, American education used to teach us about, America, our laws, our founding, but it also used to teach us about virtue. The way that we represent ourselves as an American people by being inclusive, not DEI, BS inclusive, but truly inclusive, by being polite, and by having respect for the democratic process. Well, we saw that go out the window just a few days ago with this whole fire alarm debacle in the United States House of Representatives. We have become so jaded to terrible, impolite behavior on both sides of the aisle, by the way. Totally. That we don't even react when something absurd as this happens. Over the weekend, the United States House of Representatives was voting on a Republican-led short-term spending bill to keep the government open. House Democrats were unhappy with the bill because it was Republican-led, and so they wanted to delay the voting on this particular bill. Suddenly, under those circumstances, Representative Jamal Bowman, who is a Democrat from the state of New York, went and pulled the fire alarm inside Congress. He says that he was trying to get out of the building to vote and that the doors allegedly were not opening, and he thought that pulling the alarm would open the door. But that doesn't seem to be in accordance with what we understand about the way the building works. And also, if you couldn't open the door, why would you pull the fire alarm? You know, pulling the fire alarm is going to make people evacuate the building. That is the procedure. When a fire alarm goes off, everyone has to evacuate the building. So he knew that that would happen. If the doors were locked, which the evidence does not indicate they were, why wouldn't he just call one of his people and go, hey, door's locked, can you let me back in? Or bang on the door? My God, he's a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. I think they'd also notice that he was gone for the vote. It's BS. It's just his story that he's coming up with. He says, though, that he takes responsibility for his behavior. Oh, good on you, my friend. Oh, wow, what a great demonstration of character. He just says, I was literally just in a rush to go vote, man. It's funny. Democrats use the word man. Both Joe Biden and this guy, Jamal Bowman, they use the word man a lot for being crusaders against making assumptions about people's gender labels. It's also interesting that he is a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. A Democrat would use the word man because just 2 years ago, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, she passed House rules, which included changing pronouns and terms to make them more quote unquote gender inclusive. There's this whole list of terms: mother, father, son, daughter, stepson, stepdaughter, and you're not supposed to use those words. You're supposed to substitute them for parent or child. So just wanted to highlight for you that that's a little bit interesting. Let's hear how the incredibly intellectually highbrow women on The View reacted to this incident.
Which brings us to
my buddy Jamal Bowman.
All right, so
buddy.
Okay, so Democratic House member allegedly pulled a fire alarm. He claims that it was because he was trying to get to the House floor. The video seems to, or pictures suggest otherwise. I think it was because the CR came out and he wanted more time to read the bill. But rather, again, than Congress passing a bill that would allow for him to have more time to read it, he literally pulled the fire alarm. It'd be like if I was didn't like the next topic and I pulled the fire alarm and ran out. We just can't do that.
What's absolutely ridiculous, is that there's MAGA Republicans that are somehow equating this guy doing this infantile stunt with January 6th. To my knowledge, nobody died because this guy pulled that stunt. To my knowledge, nobody was bleeding. Nobody was attacked because of this stuff.
Okay, there's a reason why Republicans, not just MAGA Republicans, but Republicans in general, are comparing this to January 6th. What happened on January 6th is that there were a bunch of people who were trying to countenance interference with a constitutionally required function. Speaking of the Constitution, it is literally said in the Constitution that on January 6th, before the inauguration of every inaugural year, the vice president is supposed to lead Congress in a procedure which counts up and certifies the electoral votes of the election to basically seal the deal for whoever won the election, okay? So those people, shame on them, stormed the Capitol trying to countenance interference in that function. How is what this guy did different from that? Here we have a representative in the U.S. House who is trying to countenance interference with another constitutionally required function. Also in the Constitution, when outlining what the U.S. House of Representatives is obligated to do, they say initiate revenue bills. That's what was going on. They were voting on a spending bill. And this guy was trying to wreak havoc to try to stop that vote. As the Democrats literally admit, they didn't want the vote to happen. So doesn't it seem pretty logical to you, given that the Democrats didn't want the vote to happen, that his motives would be pulling that alarm to stop the vote from happening? That is countenancing interference with another constitutionally required function. What I wish I could say to the View people who get so upset and shocked, surprised in the true sense of the term, when people vote for Donald Trump, what I wish I could say to them is incidents like this are why people love Donald Trump. And he is doing spectacularly well in the polls, despite having some really, really ugly moments. You know why so many people are enamored with him? It is because of this double standard that has come to exist in the United States. When people on January 6th try to interfere with a constitutionally required function, they are scorned, ridiculed, harassed, thrown in jail. When a Democrat does it, no problem. People on The View laugh about it. Oh, my buddy Jamal, gosh, what was he doing? Allegedly, he was doing something. Come on. Conservatives get shouted down when they go speak on college campuses. Democrats or liberals do not. Conservatives have to keep their views silent. They even get fired at times for espousing conservative beliefs. That doesn't happen to Democrats. Another example of this double standard, Enrique Tarrio, who was that head of the Proud Boys, got 22 years in prison, even though he wasn't even in D.C., let alone at the Capitol on January 6th for organizing or helping to organize the event. But then the many, many people who helped to organize Black Lives Matter riots, to my knowledge, have gotten 0 time in prison. Of course, some people who were rioting and violent did get time in prison, but as far as nonviolent organizers, 0. Mark Houck was arrested, had an FBI storm his home for praying in front of an abortion clinic. That's how pro-lifers are treated. But then when a professor, in a clip that I recently played on this show, kicks over a pro-life table at a college because she is pro-choice, nothing happens to her. Trump, the GOP nominee, likely nominee, gets investigated for walking down the street. Meanwhile, it has taken an act of Hercules, so much effort to get Joe Biden and his crooked son Hunter, after decades of terrible behavior, fraudulent behavior, to be investigated. Conservatives are constantly called bigots and white supremacists in names, including what Jamal Bowman said. He and his people called the people who were condemning him Nazis. But then liberals are not called names nearly to the same extent. This is the double standard that we now have in America. And so when people on The View or anyone else are so shocked when and if Donald Trump wins, this is exactly why. It is not that so many people are particularly enamored with him. It is that they are sick to death of this double system that exists front and center, as we see with this seemingly innocuous pull of a fire alarm, but it is representative of something so much greater. Speaking of potential misinformation about conservatives, there's been so much hysteria lately about a so-called book banning movement that is taking place all across the country.
It's a trend you've no doubt read about, the growing list of books banned in our nation's classrooms and libraries.
In Louisiana, the fight over banning books in public libraries is escalating.
The new culture war raging across America is over books. And they're dealing with this problem that they invented, by the way, in a time-honored way, with a good old-fashioned book ban.
We've come to Dearborn, Michigan, where a battle is brewing in the nationwide campaign to ban certain books from public school libraries.
Since last summer, parents, school boards, and thirsty political groups have pulled off over 1,500 book bans in schools across the U.S.
There was even a full-page ad in this week's New York Times about this. It says, all across the United States, books are being banned from classrooms and libraries. For those of you who are watching the show, I am holding this up. And there are titles here like The Catcher in the Rye. There are a lot of books which have African-American individuals on the cover. One book is called Bold Women in Black History, and then another book is called ABC, Deconstructing Gender. So I've heard about this and seen this in newspapers or in magazines all the time, it seems. And I've wondered, is it really true? Is there a book ban going on? Who is behind it? What books are they banning, allegedly, and why? There was actually recently a Senate Judiciary hearing on this issue, and today I'm pleased to welcome someone who testified at that Senate Judiciary hearing. His name is Max Eden. Mr. Eden is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on education reform. And before that, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's an author who has testified about school violence before Congress and about the school-to-prison pipeline before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's been published in a ton of leading magazines and journals, such as the City Journal, the Claremont Review of Books, the National Review, the New York Post, the Washington Post, USA Today, just to name a few. And as I said, he was testifying just a few weeks ago on this very subject in front of the Senate. He was one of the few voices who was actually saying that this book ban is overhyped. Hello, Mr. Eden. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So what was it like to go to the U.S. Senate and talk about this issue? How did they find you and invite you to testify?
Yeah, the Senate Judiciary staff reached out and they said, well, for some reason, we're not quite sure why, because this is the Senate Judiciary Committee, we're going to be having a hearing on book bans in a couple of weeks. Who would be good to testify? And eventually, would you be willing to testify? And I said, sure, absolutely. I thought there was a lot of stuff, a lot of kind of false information, as you said, misinformation flying around. And it's the kind of debate where as soon as it sees the light of day, as soon as you actually show what is actually at stake, what's actually being done, you really flip opinion fast on it.
So what is being done? Where is this coming from? Who's allegedly doing it? And what are they allegedly banning?
Yes. So what you will hear, maybe I'll first say what you'll hear, which is almost entirely false, right? What you will hear is there is a kind of racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic movement of parents who want to kind of destroy representation of racial and sexual and gender diversity in schools, right? And so according to PEN America, a nonprofit that tracks this stuff, over 2,500 books were banned in a single calendar year, primarily by LGBT authors or by Black authors, right? Now, that's kind of false on its own front because they define ban in a way that neither you nor I nor any speaker of English would define that word. They define a ban as any action that even temporarily limits a student's access to a book in a school library. So if a book is taken off the shelf, the school board looks at it, they put it back on the shelf. According to PEN, which informs this entire national debate, that book has been banned. If the school puts a parental notice on a book requiring parents to take it out, that book, according to PEN, has been banned. If it's moved to the guidance counselor's office, it's been banned. So in the first instance, the kind of widespread nature of this, how frequently it's happening, has been dramatically overstated by a factor of about 3/4. A colleague and I looked at all the books that had allegedly been banned, and then we checked the school libraries, and we found that in 3/4 of the instances that PEN said a book had been banned, it was actually still there.
Were you working with the Heritage Foundation in exploring Penn? Because I read recently that Heritage did something similar where they looked and found that 75% of the books that Penn had identified as being banned were actually in the libraries.
Yes, Heritage Foundation senior fellow Jay Green and I did a report on that for the Education Freedom Institute, where we found that, and we also kind of looked at the difference between books that were challenged, right? Because a parent can object on all sorts of grounds to books in school libraries, and books that were actually taken out of the school libraries. So, the books that you're showing right now, Of Mice and Men, Farewell to Arms, I'm actually not sure any of them have been challenged in recent years. I don't recall seeing them on the list, but you can see books like, for instance, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which is kind of a Black Lives Matter inspired book that was challenged by parents in about 17 districts. But every single time schools said, oh, you know what? No, we're going to keep that book after all. The books that are being challenged and taken out are the second set of books that you just flashed, books like This Book is Gay, books like Genderqueer, the kind of books that, Ron DeSantis tried to read excerpts of out loud to the media, and then they cut away because they were too explicit to be read. They would, the news organizations would subject themselves to FCC violations if they actually read the content of the book that the left is insisting must be permitted to remain in school libraries.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm understanding you correctly, 75% of the books that Penn, which is the leading organization that has studied this, 75% of the books that Penn has said were banned were not banned. They were challenged by parents or maybe restricted for certain age groups. And then the remaining 25%, you're saying, were books that were taken out of libraries or perhaps moved to different parts of libraries for those of higher age groups because they dealt with LGBTQ, sexual matters, and other things that were not age appropriate. Is that right?
To say they dealt with LGBTQ matters is frankly even being a little bit more charitable than we should be. Like the books that were actually removed, the top 10 books, half of them dealt with heterosexual encounters, half of them dealt with LGBT encounters, but they all had egregiously sexually explicit passages. The kind of passages that I think any normal parent, and in these cases, normal human school board members would look at and think, oh, you know what, that's a little bit far to just be having around in our middle school or our high school. It's really not so much books like The Bluest Eye, it's books like Genderqueer, which have, illustrations of sexual acts being performed with sex toys upon people. Books like This Book is Gay, which explains to students, here's how you use an app to find partners for casual sex. And so the books that actually get taken out are the books that, when you look at the polling, and WPA Intelligence did a poll on this, they polled some of the passages from Genderqueer directly, and they found that about 90% of voters, when they're given passages like that, say, yeah, this isn't really for school. And it's kind of interesting because before you give these passages, the polling is, as you'd expect, really in the other way. I think there was a poll by Publishers Weekly that suggested that about 70% of voters, 60% of Republicans are just categorically against book bans. Under no conditions should books be removed from school libraries. But then you show those people those passages and they're like, oh, actually, yeah, that doesn't belong there because that's porn.
Governor DeSantis, I remember, started reading aloud a passage from one of the books that was quote unquote banned. It was actually just moved to the high school section of the library. And the news channel that was covering him, live stream, had to cut him off because it was so explicit. Mr. Eden, so I was telling you in the audience that in the New York Times this week, I saw this huge, again, I'm holding it up for those who are watching, this huge full-page ad that was put in by the Hachette Book Group. They say they stand with authors, readers, and with educators and librarians to fight to protect the freedom to read. And they put up these books. I mentioned The Catcher in the Rye, and another one is Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History. Was The Catcher in the Rye or that other book about bold women in Black history, were those banned at any point?
At any point in American history, perhaps. But based on the list that I looked over, I cannot recall. do not believe that either of those books were actually banned. I can't even recall seeing them on the challenge list, to be honest. That could be an oversight, but I think I could say pretty categorically, no, they have not been pulled from school libraries.
So why do you think that this, Sean, remind me, would you correct me, Hatchett? Hatchet. H-A-C-H-E-T-T-E. I'm going to go with Hachette. I'm sure I'll be corrected on that one. So why do you think they're putting these up there? Are they working off of a different list? Are they doing it in bad faith? What's going on?
Well, I think they are possibly working off of the same list where maybe it has been challenged once. I look much more closely at the list of books that were actually removed than, I can't recall all 2,500 challenge books
right
off the top of my head. So I think part of it is that they're going off of, as we discussed, the definition of banned. That just isn't the way that any normal American would use that word. But then part of it is also just the profit motive, right? I mean, we're kind of establishing an incentive system where publishers like Hachette can find people to write young adult fiction that is extremely sexually explicit with the expectation that it will be picked up by school libraries across the country, and then generate substantial controversy, which will, of course, boost book sales outside of it. So I see it as, possibly partly empirically mistaken, but mostly cynical.
Was there any book, or perhaps multiple books, that you and your team encountered that were banned or restricted that you thought, this isn't really fair? Why is this book being taken off the list? This doesn't have any pornographic or explicit content. This is just politically motivated. Was there any example?
Offhand, I can't think of an example like that, right? There are examples like The Bluest Eye, which is banned, or which has been challenged about 20 some times. It's only removed in about 3 or 4 instances. And even though that book has very sexually explicit passages, there's still a strong argument that it has literary value, right? Toni Morrison was a Nobel Prize winning author. And so there are going to be instances where, I will look at what is being done and disagree with the moral judgments of these people, but it was few and far between. And I think for the most part, most people looking at this list would, on the whole, approve of it.
And finally, are most of these pushes to restrict or remove books coming from parents or politicians and legislators?
At this point, it's both. It really started as a grassroots parent movement when parents, saw it was happening somewhere else, looked in their own school district library and realized, oh, wow, these books are here too. And you had this groundswell of parents approaching their local school boards to read these books aloud, to ask them to take them off. But even in the cases of the top 10 books that were actually removed, which were overwhelmingly egregiously sexually explicit, they were actually kept in the school libraries more often than not. And so I think there was a lot of unmet appetite, political will from parents to state legislators to say, hey, can we at least streamline this removal process? And we've seen states like Florida, states like Tennessee, states like Texas kind of make that process more transparent. And, one interesting thing is, you talked about the testimony at the beginning. This has traditionally been a kind of a Democrat media talking point issue, but more Republicans showed up to that hearing than Democrats, and more Republicans were kind of charged to speak about it passionately than Democratic senators. And I think, to how you began this segment, this really is a perfect example of how, when you look at the news story, when you look at what's in the media, it really seems, black and white. Republicans are bigots, conservatives are backwards. But then you look under the cover, so to speak, you look directly at it and you're like, oh, wow, no, I agree with them.
Yes.
So I think the more time goes on, the more this debate will flip. And, it's kind of an unpleasant debate to have because it requires, as I did, as Senator Kennedy did, actually showing parents, these are the passages that we're talking about, which are shocking and appalling and not something that any normal person should take pleasure in doing. But it really is an instance where, when you actually see what's going on, it turns out that the far right opinion is shared by about 90% of Americans.
Mm-hmm. This has been enlightening. I mean, it confirms what I was saying earlier about the double standard. You know, conservatives are smeared as people who are book banning and trying to suppress speech, and it's actually the other side that is overwhelmingly doing that, certainly with suppressing speech. And just anecdotally, I know several high schools here in Los Angeles, private schools, which have taken To Kill a Mockingbird off of their reading list because it has the N-word, the full N-word in it. So who's the one banning books, my friends? Mr. Eden has answered that question. And as a final note, how fascinating is it that ban means restrict or challenge? This Orwellian world we live in. I mean, to give another example, Luis Rubiales, who's the head of the Spanish Soccer Federation, kissed a female player for 1 second. Should he have done it? No. But his kiss is being called sexual harassment and sexual assault. Assault is not a kiss, but in this world we live in, bans are restrictions, assault are kisses, you know, up is down, left is right, furthering this theme that we all see. Thank you so much again for your time. This has been very, as I said, enlightening.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to do it.
You know, the theme of this episode, now that I think about it, has really been about democracy. That's something that both the left and the right agree is being threatened. But if you look at the three things that we discussed today, you know, a lot of people shrug off that Americans don't know about the Constitution. They shrug off instances like a Democratic representative pulling a fire alarm to thwart a democratic process. But then they get so up in arms about an alleged book ban, which, as we just learned, is really not occurring, is really just a restriction. It's fascinating that in this hysteria over democracy, the things that are really threatening democracy are being tossed out as insignificant, and then the things that aren't really threatening democracy are being characterized as the biggest threat known to man. What a confused, morally time we live in. Thanks for joining me. I hope to see you all soon. Take care.